So this is a recent opinion I developed when I started thinking about Fallen Order as a core game. I used to think relatively highly about it, but then my opinion changed to it being just an okay game. And the more I think about it, I think this game got way too much praise for its actual quality. You know how I said that The Mandalorian was overrated because people were so desperate to love Star Wars again that they lowered their standards so that they can consume anything that exceeded those low standards? Season 1 is meh and Season 2 is bleh. For more information, check out my 2 videos on The Mandalorian. The point I'm making is that Fallen Order is being praised for a similar reason. Disney gave the rights to Star Wars to EA, which is not something you can tell me was a good thing in the slightest. It was a greedy business decision by Disney after shutting down LucasArts, which in itself was also a flat-out stupid business decision. Anyways, what EA did with a Star Wars license was even worse than you could possibly imagine. We got a shitty cash grab mobile game, fuck you. Then we got the Dust of Bones video game that was Battlefront 2015, that locked half of its content behind an expensive season pass, had no campaign or the Clone Wars. That's where the bar was set so low. Battlefront 2 was a hopeful return to quality, which ended up not being the case given the loot boxes, pay-to-win casino crap, and a Disney-fied campaign that was poorly written and made no sense. You bet your asses I'll cover Battlefront 2's campaign at some point. I'm not sure if I should ever overlook the game's launch, because EA didn't budge or move a single inch until politicians got involved. This loot box crap is something I blame on both Disney and EA, because EA was obviously not a company that could be trusted with Star Wars games. Plus, when it comes to something like Battlefront 2's campaign, had the writers had full creative freedom or had something like the old expanded universe to work with, the story would have been insanely better. Disney's Star Wars in general is so simplistic and grounded that it's fucking boring. The thing that made Star Wars so exciting is how much they blow you away. The expanded universe on top of that was sheer insanity done right. The stories were so mind-blowing that it made Star Wars one of the greatest franchises ever. So what does this have to do with Fallen Order? Well, Fallen Order, despite the writer's best efforts, still has a lot of Disney's influence. And considering one of those writers was Chris Avellone, who was the lead designer of a little game, you might have heard of it, it was called Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords. Yeah, he wrote that as well. And the contrast between those two games and their stories is honestly pathetic. How did Chris Avellone go from writing this to a possibly decent story like Fallen Order? To further point out the contrast, a little known fact you might not know is that Chris Avellone wasn't actually a Star Wars fan yet when he was making KOTOR 2, but he still wrote a groundbreaking story despite not being enthused on what franchise he was writing. Now, Chris Avellone wasn't the only writer on Fallen Order, but being one of the writers, you'd think he would have come up with something better than The Force Unleashed at the very least, but he didn't. And the reason I most subscribe to as to why is Disney. Disney have really limited what all writers can do. Star Wars stories have to be simplistic and grounded, just like the sequel trilogy, just like Star Wars Rebels, just like Star Wars Resistance, and so on. So I don't actually blame the Fallen Order writers for such a cookie-cutter story. Had they been allowed to do more, we might have actually gotten an even better story. The biggest equivalence I equate Fallen Order to is The Force Unleashed. They are polar opposites in many ways, but they are both stories set in between the events of episodes 3 and 4 that tell the story of a young Force user. When I say they were polar opposites in many ways, I mean it. The Force Unleashed has far more interesting and engaging gameplay than Fallen Order. Now, personally, I was never a Dark Souls or Metroidvania player, so this may be biased, but The Force Unleashed is a way better game than Fallen Order. The Force Unleashed is an over-the-top game where you use the Force to a ridiculous degree and fight enemies of ridiculous size and scale. There's a sequence where Starkiller pulls a Star Destroyer down from the goddamn sky. It's exciting. Fallen Order is nowhere near as interesting. Obviously, Fallen Order has a different approach, where you are a more inexperienced Force user that has to regain his abilities he was taught, and learn to become a Jedi once more. I'm really not trying to say that Over the Top is better than something that's more down to earth, but even with the approach Fallen Order has, I don't think it does the best with its concept. As I said, Force Unleashed and Fallen Order are polar opposites, and we have to keep that in mind. Fallen Order, in my opinion, has pretty standard gameplay. It's open to heavy improvement. I'm the kind of player who has not a lot of patience, so the game expecting me for the right opportunity was tedious. I hear Dark Souls was like this too, but from what I hear, Dark Souls is more worth it because you get loot for your patience and skill. Fallen Order doesn't really have that. Sure, you level up, but the stuff you level up for isn't very engaging. More health, more force usage, shit like that, is more of a convenience than something I enjoy getting. Maybe they could have gone out of their way to expand the leveling up and give us creative and unique perks that make the game more interesting. I would have also liked to use more than a lightsaber. I think this also applies to the Force Unleashed to an extent. I would have liked to use more weapons there, but I think it's more applicable to Fallen Order because of how the game was designed. Why not add cool new weapons or a force ability that's really cool to use? Given how Fallen Order is a light side Jedi story, the force abilities are really basic. Also, there's something that makes the lightsaber combat less satisfying. The fact that the violence level isn't a bit higher than what it is. Given how the lightsaber feels in this game, it would have been so much better if everything got sliced off. Stormtroopers, one of the main enemies, don't get cut into pieces when you kill them. It's only against droids and animals where a lot of this shit happens. I've heard that this is because Disney wants to make everything family friendly at best, so they forced Respawn Entertainment to tone down the violence. But I think they should have just had it be optional for the game to be less violent. Disney's squeaky clean image is something no one buys anymore. Why are they still trying to act like they have a shred of humanity? Whatever. It's stuff like this which supports my point that Disney canon's nature and Disney itself really held this game back from its full potential. I don't think this was an issue in The Force Unleashed because the lightsaber felt more like a lightsaber. Fallen Order's lightsaber feels like a baseball bat or a blunt object. It doesn't feel like a lightsaber, if that makes sense. The selection of enemies are very meh. Granted, there's a lot of enemies, but I found little of them fun to fight. Stormtroopers compared in The Force Unleashed were fun to fight in my opinion, were less to do with the combat themselves, and more so their behaviors and ragdoll physics. It was fun slicing them with the ragdoll physics, or force pushing them into a wall, or out into an abyss or whatever. There was a lot of interactivity. Fallen Order Stormtroopers are really basic. To block a Stormtrooper's blaster, you need to time the block button when the blaster bolt is coming towards you. There's no ragdoll physics beyond maybe force pushing a Stormtrooper off a cliff or into a spinning fan or whatever, but it's not very enjoyable to do so because the ragdoll physics are not exciting enough. Death animations are really basic. You can't slice through them in a satisfactory way, and the ragdoll physics are not at all engaging. Now, a game doesn't need good ragdoll physics, but death animations are really boring. That's why I prefer The Force Unleashed in this respect. I should probably talk about something else now. Let's talk about navigation. My god, the navigation. I'm personally not a fan of confusing maps, so Fallen Order is not my type of game. But the environments themselves are really basic. Compare Kashyyyk in The Force Unleashed to Fallen Order. There's a clear difference. Some of you might say that Kashyyyk in Fallen Order has more character, but I disagree. On top of the physics in Force Unleashed, Kashyyyk had more character in The Force Unleashed because it felt more real within the Star Wars universe. Fallen Order feels like a goddamn maze. Kashyyyk is supposed to be a forest planet, and Kashyyyk in Fallen Order feels wrong. It doesn't feel like a natural formation. Like in The Force Unleashed, the layout of the two Kashyyyk missions made sense. It would be practical to navigate in-universe. But Fallen Order's Kashyyyk just isn't. It does look amazing visually, but that's about it. There's probably more reasons I'm not thinking of, but since I usually struggle to describe game design, I'll stop here. Collectibles are something that are not desirable in Fallen Order. I felt more incentive to find secret stuff in The Force Unleashed than Fallen Order. And that's because the cosmetics in Force Unleashed were way more interesting. The appearances for Starkiller were well designed, and sometimes there weren't even skins based on Starkiller to begin with, like C-3PO, Darth Sion from KOTOR 2, Mace Windu. Hell yeah! Plus, the upgrades for extra lightsaber colors and crystals were more interesting. Since Fallen Order's worlds aren't interesting, I never really thought that you had an incentive to explore the world and find everything. Plus, the cosmetics were petty color changes for your outfit, poncho, or paint jobs for your droid or ship. It's mostly skins that you won't use. That's not unheard of in The Force Unleashed, but most of them were actually something you would use. I would actually struggle to decide what skin I wanted in The Force Unleashed, because they were all so cool. Fallen Order doesn't have that. All the cosmetic stuff are boring color changes, and they are all based off the main character. The Inquisitor outfit in that free update is probably the only cool one, because it's the closest to being what The Force Unleashed has. And no, cosmetic mods don't count since they're mods, thereby not made by the studio. Now, with those aspects of gameplay and design out of the way, I wanted to talk about the story, and probably the most important part of this game. Since the game doesn't really have much of a unique identity in its design, the story is probably what this game had going for it the most. But the problem I have with the story is that it's really basic. I keep saying that. It's not special in any way. This story feels like it has the most basic traditional hero's journey story I've ever seen. Now, I'm not one of those idiots that complained about Cal Kestis being a boring white male protagonist, because he's actually the opposite. He's the first lead ginger in the Star Wars story, as a matter of fact.
Gingers have souls!
But Cal Kestis feels closer to a background Jedi in the prequels that has a story in like a throwaway book or comic than a main protagonist in a Star Wars video game. Like, there doesn't seem to be a reason why there's a story focusing on him specifically. Like with Starkiller, he was the secret apprentice of Darth Vader, and that's the hook that would get you to buy the game. Now, you might say that he's an everyman, and that's how I would probably describe his character too, but he's not a very interesting everyman compared to someone like Luke Skywalker. Just to make it clear, Cal Kestis, in my opinion, is fine, but that's just it. He's a fine character. He isn't special in any kind of story, including his own. Like, to show you what I mean, Cal Kestis feels like he has virtually no impact on the Star Wars galaxy. Like, Starkiller was a tool used by the Emperor and Vader to root out the rebels, but ends up saving said rebels and being the catalyst for the Rebel Alliance, as his family crest is used as the symbol for that faction. What Cal Kestis does in the story, on a larger level, is retrieve a holocron, which he then destroys so the Empire can't use it. Given how the Empire already has Inquisitors, it makes this victory seem very minor. The Empire was ruled by a Sith under the rule of 2 after all, so I don't see how this would change anything. It doesn't exactly feel like a story that actually happened. It feels more like inserting Forrest Gump into events, except it's an off-screen stuff that's mentioned in a book, if that makes sense. So what about his personality and his self-conflict? Well, I felt that that was really basic. His conflict is something that could literally be applied to any other Jedi that survived Order 66. Like, Obi-Wan chilling on Tatooine would still be feeling the loss of the Jedi Order, have some guilt and doubts over what could have been, and probably would have spent all this time in exile just keeping a low profile. There's not really a unique spin to the whole thing, and it makes Cal Kestis feel unneeded. A Jedi Padawan who survived Order 66, on its own, is a really cookie-cutter idea for a Star Wars story. There's literally so many Padawans who survived Order 66 in both timelines. Cal Kestis doesn't need to do anything different to shake up the formula. Like, he doesn't need to do or experience anything that makes him stand out or justifies a story like this. Cal Kestis, I think, should have had something to him that makes him interesting just by describing his role in the story, because Padawan that survived Order 66 is so generic. What about someone who has some sort of new problem related to the Force? Or what if he's a survivor of Order 66 that survived the Purge and was prepared with what to do due to having a background of caution? Or someone who had the foresight to see Order 66 coming? I don't know, they've probably all been done before, but they put a spin on the trope. The plot in concept itself is pretty generic. There's no opening title crawl, which is the norm at this point, but it's still a disgrace. There's nothing that really hooks you into the story. Sure, the story sets up the conflict and the journey, but there's no hook at the start. Cal Kestis is just doing a job that, while dangerous, we know that he can handle without a sweat. I think the story should have been massively improved with a title crawl, establishing that the Empire is purging the Jedi, one by one, after the regime rose in the first place. And maybe Cal Kestis slipped up somehow and showed signs that he was a Jedi, but not to a full extent. So there's been a bit of increased Imperial presence on Bracca looking for clues, and Cal is trying to blend in again. And we see that he slips up again when he saves his friend using Force Slow. I don't know, I'm just spitballing to come up with a more exciting and engaging start. Anyways, Cal Kestis and his friend Prof, who, I'm starting to agree with Anomaly's point about aliens having accents. It feels so out of place for this dude to have a basic English language accent, whether it be American, Canadian, British, or whatever is in the English caliber. He should probably sound more like an alien. Give him some sort of dialect. Anyways, Cal Kestis uses the Force to save Prof, which is an understandable plot point, and perfectly normal for a story like this. But I was never really that invested in the story. I think it sort of picked up after it was revealed that the second sister was the former apprentice of Cal's new mentor, Sia Junda, whose actress really distracted me. Given the contrast between the character she played in Wolfenstein 2 and this game. They're both way different characters. I guess it's just a nitpick, but Deborah Wilson isn't really suited to the character she was given. Grease Stridus is fine. He's decently charismatic and amusing, but he felt too much like he was based on a sitcom comic relief character or something, which according to Wikipedia, he was. When it comes to the second sister, she's not a very imposing antagonist. She mostly just came across as a smug shit-talker in the early stages of the game. Things did get more interesting when she revealed that she was Sia's former apprentice Trilla, and that Sia sold her out to the Empire, and it made for an interesting hook from the reveal all the way to making it back to the Mantis to confront Sia about the revelation. But after that, it kinda dries out. Not completely, of course. There's still quite a bit of conflict with the second sister and Sia. Half of the planets I think introduced in this game are completely new, and given how we don't have side quests or much dialogue to flesh out these worlds, they feel underdeveloped as worlds. Take Bogano as an example. Given how the only interactions are between crew members, the planets don't have any personality beyond how they look. And let me get this out of the way. Force echoes are an interesting idea, but they serve the same practical purpose as something like holotapes in the Fallout games. It's also how you come across Force echoes that really undermines them. Most of the time, I just stumble into them and I just interact with them to increase my health or Force strength. That's it. Or just because. Stormtrooper banter doesn't tell us much either. Dialogue beyond the main story is uninteresting and is tied to underdeveloped side stories. So I think I should go through the story in detail now. As mentioned before, the story just starts out of nowhere instead of a title crawl. We get a tutorial of Cal Kestis and his friend Prof get sent to retrieve some scrap on the world of Bracca. Since all we know about Cal at this point is that he's a Jedi who survived Order 66, I don't think his introduction is the best. What I do like about the very first scene is the music Cal listens to. There's actually a video on YouTube that shows a Mongolian band doing the song, and it actually sounds like an alien band. So why the hell couldn't a character like Prof be like that? It's great music that's very fitting of Star Wars in nature. Anyways, Cal and Prof find a Jedi starfighter. Now, I'm not going to criticize Cal's quiet personality, given how he's a Jedi in hiding, but I do think Baraka doesn't get enough screen time in the story. We don't really get to see much of Cal blending in with everyone else. The tutorial just has Cal navigate to the Jedi fighter with Prof, and when the cables get loose, Prof is about to fall to his death, and Cal saves him using Force Slow, the only power he remembers from his Jedi training. Now, as I've mentioned before, I have no issue with this. Cal being a Jedi in hiding and being good friends with Prof would make the split-second decision to risk his discovery to the Empire and save his friend. Prof expresses his surprise with what happened, and Cal tells him to shut up and never talk about it with anyone. Now, I think the game should have gone more in depth on Cal Kestis' life in hiding, like how hard it is to suppress his training, and maybe the close calls he's had, plus the widespread anti-Jedi sentiment after the rise of the Empire. I would have liked to see more of that, because it transitions from low-profile Cal to I'm done hiding Cal way too quickly. If the CG trailer for the game could establish Cal's situation, why can't the actual game? Because remember, there are people who don't watch the trailers and just buy the games or whatever because they love Star Wars. Plus, it isn't up to the trailers to establish any of this shit. Other than that, the start is fine. Keyword, fine. The Inquisitors show up and do a lineup of Cal and the rest of the Scrapper Guild. And this sequence actually reminds me of my favorite scene in Rogue One, the lineup scene. Yes, this is my favorite scene in Rogue One. For context, this scene has Director Krennic have a couple of Death Star engineers line up and believes one of them conspired against the Empire and contacted the Rebellion about the Death Star. Galen Erso is in fact the traitor, and none of these engineers are, but he isn't on the lineup. When Krennic demands the traitor step forward and no one does, he decides to consider it a group effort and orders his death troopers to execute all the engineers, but just when he's about to, Galen steps in and confirms he is the traitor. Now, obviously, the scene is a bit different to the one in Fallen Order. The guilty one is in the lineup, and Cal doesn't give himself up and doesn't plan to, and only reveals himself when the second sister kills his friend. But like Rogue One, the Inquisitors demand the traitor give himself up, or everyone in the lineup dies. This scene isn't as intense as the one in Rogue One. I cared about those Death Star engineers far more than I cared about Cal's Scrapper colleagues. I've said before that a character doesn't need to speak for us to care about them, but we need some kind of connection to them. With the Death Star engineers, we know who they are to a vague extent, and we understand that they are completely innocent, as we know Galen is the one who contacted the Rebellion. With Cal's Scrapper colleagues, we don't really know who they are beyond being other Scrappers, and we don't have a connection to them earlier in the game. They're sort of just background characters. It's hard to explain given how they have no dialogue like the Death Star engineers. Maybe I cared about the Death Star engineers because we care about Galen, and we know his struggle, but with Cal, these Scrapper colleagues besides Prof have no scene relationship with Cal. Prof decides to step forward and rant about the Empire, to where the second sister kills him, and Cal reveals himself and tries to escape. So anyways, we learn the basics of lightsaber combat here, and we eventually meet a duo, with Seer Junda arriving in a ship piloted by Grease to help Cal. After a fake boss fight with the second sister, as in a boss fight you can't actually win, there's a couple of those in the game, Cal makes it to the ship, and the basic setup for the story is established. As I've said before, it's a basic setup, and not much more. Anyways, Seer brings Cal to Bogano and tells him to meet someone on the planet, which turns out to be the droid BD-1. Now, I dislike how this game is doing the same as Star Wars Rebels, and showing us a crew with a pilot, a Jedi Master, a Padawan, and a droid like it's some sort of requirement. It's something that bugs me, and it's a Disney Star Wars trope I'm tired of. Did Dave Filoni have anything to do with this game? Because his influence is certainly felt. Beyond that, Cal and BD-1 have some good banter throughout the game. Anyways, they make it to the temple, and the droid has a recording of a Jedi called Eno Cordova, who has a holocron hidden away in the temple, and the only way to unlock it is to go to different planets in a path Cordova created. So after a talk with Sia, where she says her goal is to rebuild the Jedi Order with the holocron Cordova locked away, which has a list of Force-sensitive children across the galaxy, we go on the path Cordova created. So basically the motivation for Cal is to find the holocron. On my first playthrough, I guessed immediately that the holocron was going to be destroyed at the end, so it didn't make for the most interesting treasure hunt. It's not the game's fault given the timeline, but it's still a problem with the story. Going to Zepho, the homeworld of the Zepho, the builders of the ancient temple on Bogano, the game is basically like KOTOR, where you choose which planets you can go to so you can progress the story. Since on my first playthrough I did it out of the intended order, I got a little confused. In a playthrough without fault, it's recommended that you go to Dathomir last. So at Zepho, most of the game is actually navigating a confusing world. It's hardly obvious where you're supposed to go a lot of the time, and you can occasionally get stuck backtracking. In this portion of the game, we must make it to the tomb of a Zepho sage, and let me say, I hated this part. Story-wise, it's lacking, but given how you're supposed to solve a puzzle, it's annoying. You learn Force Push here also. I should also mention that the game has a lot of flashbacks whenever you relearn a new Force ability. Again, given the lack of side quests and more interesting lore to discover, the beginning of Zepho is underwhelming at best. The only thing that really happens is that we get access to a new planet, Kashyyyk. Kashyyyk is probably the most visually interesting planet of the whole bunch. It's probably because of the films and how Kashyyyk is a widely explored planet in general. We start with an impressive set piece where we have to board an AT-AT. I just wish it didn't take 5 minutes to climb. We board it, and thankfully, despite moving a slow-ass vehicle, the AT-AT is actually fun to use and doesn't outstay its welcome. It's here where we are reintroduced to Saw Gerrera and the other partisans.
The three of us this morning, I'm the only one this evening, but I must go on. The frontiers are my prison. Oh, the wind is blowing. Through the graves, the wind is blowing. Freedom soon will come. Then will come from the shadows.
Anyways, the partisans team up with Cal to liberate Kashyyyk and weaken the Empire. Now, unlike the holocron itself, I do feel as if my actions are actually doing something here. What is annoying is just like Zepho, we have to return later and do something else. So it's back to Zepho. Basically this time, we have to stop the Empire from digging into the Zepho Sage's tomb, which turns out to be a trap laid by the second sister. So as I've mentioned before, the second sister turns out to be Trilla, Sia's former apprentice that she mentioned earlier in the game. As a plot twist, I found this decently surprising. I do suppose it's the best they could have done with a plot twist like, oh my, it turns out that he/she is still alive. Still, I found the second sister to not be that compelling as a villain. As I've said before, she's just a smug shit talker, and she never really came across like a truly angry person. Also, I think it's just me, but why is the second sister working for the Empire exactly? Like, what I mean is that the Empire had her broken in the first place. I suppose it's just nitpicking, but unlike other characters that fell to the dark side, the second sister always stood out in this regard. Anyways, I didn't like the navigation back to the Mantis, mostly because there's an insufferable puzzle that goes on longer than Transformers Age of Extinction, aka a very long and boring movie. You are captured by a bounty hunter that is impossible to defeat, and basically when you break out, you have to fight like a gladiator. This sequence is actually pretty cool, mostly because confusing navigation is minimal, and also because the presentation is perfect, as the game builds up to a gladiator fight, and it's interesting figuring out where you are. Making it back to the Mantis, Cal of course confronts Sia about Trilla, and we get some insight into Sia's troubles. Anyways, it's back to Kashyyyk. Basically we have a lead on where Tarful is, and so we have to travel away from the Imperial factory, and go into the Shadowlands and whatnot to get to him. I don't understand why Tarful couldn't meet us in the factory, but oh well, I guess we had to stretch our legs. It's a gameplay contrivance at best. When we meet Tarful, he tells us that to continue following Eno Cordova's path, we must first make it up a willow tree. It's a long way to the top. On the way, we meet a huge bird that we befriend, and also the Ninth Sister, a bulky inquisitor that has little character. The Ninth Sister has little personality and presence. In fact, she was only set up earlier in the game, in the background, mostly to set her up as a boss fight later. She doesn't have any proper introduction, and the game leaves it a little too obvious that she'll be back for future games in this sub-series. Next, it's time for Dathomir, home of the Night Sisters. Dathomir is sort of like the Korriban of this game, being the dark, corrupted place in the game, and probably the hardest of the planet in terms of enemies. Basically, Cal gets to Dathomir and meets Night Sister Merrin, who attacks him immediately due to a misunderstanding. We eventually meet Taran Malicos, a dude who sort of looks like a medieval character, but also looks like he could have easily passed as a Dark Jedi in the old Expanded Universe comics. All the smack I've been talking about so far is about to be turned on its head, because the third act is pretty great, which is around this time. You see, after an insufferable segment where we get cut off and have to go all the way back up, we get a compelling sequence of the guilt Cal has over his master Jarrow T'Pol, in what is most definitely the highlight of the game. Now granted, a character that resembles Zeb from Rebels, wearing Anakin Skywalker's armor in the Clone Wars is a bit silly, but it makes some sort of sense. Anyways, in the midst of Order 66, Jarrow T'Pol and Cal Kestis are betrayed by their clones. Jarrow T'Pol is a character that we see to a minor extent, but we feel his death due to his connection to Cal Kestis. This character is spoken about quite a lot during the main game. We learn why Cal feels shame and guilt over his master's death, and while the clones lack characterization, it's not necessary given how they became hostile to Cal and his master. A nice touch is playing the Order 66 music from the one and only best Star Wars movie, Revenge of the Sith. This eventually results in Cal destroying his lightsaber. The same lightsaber that is revealed to be the one from Jarrow T'Pol, since Cal lost his lightsaber during Order 66. So the lightsaber is literally all Cal has left of what his master meant to him. Given how his lightsaber is broken, Taran Malicos reveals who he really is, given how up until that point, he tried posing as a normal wanderer, but they don't get to talk much given how Merrin attacks both of them. Cal decides to go back to the lightsaber crystal planet Ilum, the planet that will eventually become the Death Star 3 ripoff, known as Starkiller Base. Basically, he goes a while without the lightsaber, but the payoff is worth it, given how we get a cool new lightsaber ability, alongside a recording of Eno Cordova erasing BD-1's memory. Returning to Dathomir, Cal finally confronts his fears and overcomes his trauma. The dialogue here is gripping and well written. It's followed up by an excellent confrontation from Taran Malicos, who represents fallen Jedi. And to be fair to him, he does somewhat have a point about the Jedi, and he's not the bad guy in the sense that he's evil, but the flaws of his character is that he's too aggressive and confrontagious. He tries to kill Cal when he's not interested in his idea to build a different order. Still, he does have a point, but Cal Kestis still believes the Jedi can be restored and learn from past mistakes. So the boss fight is pretty cool, and given how Merrin at this point realizes that Taran Malicos lied to her about the nature of the Night Sister massacres, she assists Cal Kestis in defeating Malicos. And of course, they leave it too obvious that he'll be back in another game, because being buried alive just isn't enough to fully kill off a character convincingly. So Cal offers Merrin a place on the Mantis and she accepts. Now, there's a lot of fan fiction based on a potential romance between the two characters, which I feel is completely premature, given how there is far from enough development. Like seriously, there could just as well be another character that will pursue a romance subplot with Cal in the future. There's barely any on-screen interaction. Their relationship so far is purely platonic. I'm saying this because I don't want to see any more stupid fan fictions until it's established otherwise. Also, I don't think this is an appropriate time to have a romance subplot. Well, anyways, I do sort of think Marin joining the Mantis is sort of late, but it's tolerable. Anyways, with everything completed, we go back to Bogano and open the vault, only for the second sister to show up and ruin my day. She takes the holocron, and we have to travel to the Fortress Inquisitorius to get the holocron. The climax is the other great highlight, because there's no confusing navigation. We finally get to the second sister and defeat her. Sierra and Trilla reconcile their faults with each other before, holy shit, he shows up. Which is what I would say if the internet and EA themselves didn't spoil it. Assholes. Despite it being spoiled, the moment is pretty cool. You worked your ass off to defeat the second sister, but she's nothing compared to the might of Darth Vader. Now, Darth Vader at its core is supposed to be a tragic character, but his badass nature works here because of his small but notable impact on the ending. Plus, despite the game being about tragedy, we've already explored Vader's broken state in Revenge of the Sith. We barely escaped Vader, and given his tendencies for defeating Jedi, that's quite a compliment for Cal. I would like to say that the ending is not really that impressive, because Cal just destroys the holocron and asks where to go to next. I think the ending set itself too much for a sequel. Now granted, it's nowhere near as bad as The Force Awakens and its abrupt cliffhanger, but it's still annoying. Also, I think the holocron should have been destroyed in the fortress. Maybe by a desperate measure by Cal to keep it out of the hands of Vader and the Empire. Also, I dislike the final line of the game. So where to now? It's really unsatisfactory, and I think the ending should have been more conclusive because it feels too much like an open thread for a sequel. And that's sort of an issue because Cal wasn't seen anywhere in the Galactic Civil War. So where was he exactly? Is he going to help Luke Skywalker rebuild the Jedi Order? That seems like the natural thing to do, although I'd hate it when eventually Kylo Ren destroys the Jedi Order. Jesus, it's because of The Last Jedi that I have no hope in the end of Cal's story. Disney didn't really think about the long-term future. So that's my critique of Jedi Fallen Order. It's an easy 7 out of 10 game, and I agree with the scores from professional critics, who I feel just this once are right on the mark with the objective quality of the game. I think too many people are touting this out to be the greatest Star Wars game ever or whatever, when so many games from the Lucas era are so much more compelling. Fallen Order is pretty basic in every area. It's not a very original game, and its identity can be chalked up to Dark Souls Metroidvania with a Star Wars skin. I've tried my hardest to explain why I think this is overrated, but I'm still probably going to get comments loathing me for not seeing this game as a masterpiece. Knights of the Old Republic is a way better game, and maybe some of my gripes are due to personal taste, but I think my complaints on the story are very much warranted. I think because of the nightmare of EA having exclusive game rights, people overpraise this game, since it was the first single-player experience since The Force Unleashed 2 in 2010. It was a 9-year wait. 9 long years. I think the graphics also aren't as good as what they could have been, and rendering is an issue sometimes, but that about wraps up my critique of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
We found you hiding, we found you lying, choking on the dirt and sand. Your former glories and all your stories, dragged and washed with